Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Bakari K. Lumumba. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Bakari K. Lumumba, and I am, of course, the director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Center here at Sacramento State University. Very happy to have you all here with me as we will be having our inaugural first Lunch and Learn series of the semester, where we will be interviewing Barrister Dwayne Omowale. We'll be discussing Black people, the original Americans, demystifying African Diasporan Origin Myths. So without further ado, family, make sure, give me a strong help, provide a strong virtual welcome to the man, the myth, the legend, your favorite historian's favorite historian, your favorite Pan-Africanist, favorite Pan-Africanist, none other than Barrister Dwayne Omowale. Brother Dwayne, how are you doing today?
Doing well. How have you been?
I'm doing quite all right, quite all right. Long time no see here in these YouTube streets, right?
Yeah. We both been busy, so
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So we're going to get started, but before we do, we want to, of course, go over just some ground rules here at the MLK Center, and that will start, of course, with a land acknowledgement. The MLK Center at Sacramento State acknowledges, with respect, the land our campus is on today. Was and continues to be the homelands of the indigenous people of this area. The larger Sacramento area and its rivers serve as a gathering place for local peoples from the surrounding valley and foothills. Sacramento State recognizes these lands and riverways as unceded traditional territories of indigenous peoples. We further recognize these California indigenous nations and respect their sovereignty. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm the university's commitment to build relationships and foster a university environment of success to better serve indigenous nations and communities. Welcome to the MLK Center's YouTube channel. Who are we? The MLK Center is a central hub for the exploration of African and African Diasporan heritage and culture. The overall center is designed to foster an ethos of success that permeates scholarly experience, the community, and the world by setting a tone of change and lifelong improvement that inspires and fulfills the dream of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The center partners with local businesses and community organizations to assist students in making college and career connections. In addition, the MLK Center coordinates robust cultural programming to foster a sense of belonging and student inclusion that foments cultural empowerment and academic success. And if you have not, make sure you make a gift to the MLK Center via the link in the description below. And of course, housekeeping, please remain muted during the presentation. Please feel free to share any questions or comments using the chat space. At the end of Mr. Omowale's talk, the MLK Center team will surface questions from the chat for Mr. Omowale during Q&A sessions. Q&A session, participants are welcome to unmute to ask their questions. Closed captioning is provided during the session. You can access it by clicking the closed caption icon on the lower right corner of your video box. And of course, if you want to discuss, of course, today's Lunch and Learn series, make sure you use the hashtag MLK Center Lunch. All right, so we're going to kind of dive right in. Well, we're not going to dive right in. We're going to ask some questions, of course. And the first question is, what are some African diasporan origin myths?
So I don't even know where to get started with that. It seems like every year they're coming with more and more myths. But I think
Yes.
essentially at its core, what that refers to are these different myths that African people come up with to create an identity for ourselves, which is not rooted in our African origin. This
Yes.
comes out of really a self-hatred on the part of African people. It comes out of an internalized inferiority complex in which for many generations African people have been made to feel as though we are inferior by the very fact that we are an African people. So because of this, many of our people have essentially tried to attach ourselves to different identities. So some of the myths which we'll be discussing today are myths including this idea that we're not actually African people, but that we're indigenous Americans who've been here all along. More extreme variations of this type of myth would even argue that the slave trade never happened. The slave trade itself was a myth. Other claims to different identities that we've seen are certain people who claim to be Hebrew Israelites, people who claim to be Moors, the Asiatic black men. That's the claim made by the Nation of Islam, that we're actually Asiatic black people rather than being Africans. And as I pointed out, all of these claims come from this idea that we don't want to identify as African people because we associate our Africanness with something negative. So we try to attach ourselves to different identities to escape being African.
Mhm. And so we talked about self-hatred. Are there other issues? Could that be a lack of cultural memory, maybe miseducation, pedestalization of different identities?
Yeah, that as well. Those also I think are secondary factors because I mean at the core what it is that we just lack of pride in who we are, but part of that lack of pride does come from the fact that many of us don't actually have a proper education in terms of what it is to be an African. I know I could speak from my own experience that very rarely do we get any type of African history in schools. So a lot of our people are left in a situation where we don't know very much about our identity as African people. We don't know very much about our history as African people. Where we live in a society, a global society. This isn't just an American issue. This is something we find globally. That the societies we live in are very anti-Black societies. They're very anti-African societies. So if you're faced with these notions that we're an inferior people on a daily basis and you don't have the proper educational framework to combat this inferiority complex, it breeds a situation in which many of our people look to outside identities and create different myths to bolster their self-esteem and to create the sense of identity because we don't believe that we have one.
Very good. There are a lot of discussions regarding the dialectics of history. Of course, we're leaning into some of the concepts and ideas of our dear ancestor Walter Rodney. Could you share how one engages or studies history accurately? Because there's a lot of information out there. Some would argue misinformation. How would one know what information is accurate, what information is inaccurate when studying history?
Yeah, so that's a multi-layered process. I think the first thing you'd have to be aware of is the source. Where are you getting your information from? Is the information a primary source, meaning that it's information coming from somebody who was a first-hand witness to the situations being recorded, someone who was directly involved or was there at the time and place that these events happened? Or are you looking at a secondary source? And a secondary source are sources that are written or recorded on the basis of utilizing primary sources. So that's the first thing you have to be aware of when you're engaging in researching history. Look at the sources. And sources are also important, not just in terms of understanding secondary versus primary, but also sources are important in terms of understanding who is the individual recording this history and what purpose are they recording it for. So particularly as African people, this is important to keep in mind when we're reading certain European records of African history, because we know many of these records were written with a particular Eurocentric bias, a particular racist bias against African people. So when you're reading a certain European narrative of African history, obviously we can't take at face value claims that African people were lazy or savages or the type of things that we find in the colonial narrative. So it's important to understand that when you're engaging in any sort of study of history, that sources are important, not only from the standpoint of, as I pointed out, is it a primary source or is it a secondary source and the differences between the two, but also what is the particular bias of the source that you're getting your information from, and also are there conflicting sources. So very often when you're studying history, you'll come into situations where you might find conflicting claims about certain things, and that's where you have to really engage in the process of unraveling why is there a contradiction between the two claims and how to reconcile that. And one of the ways you do that is typically in situations where there are conflicting claims, the source that seems to have less of a bias or less of a reason to lie about a particular situation might be a more valid or more accurate source. So as I pointed out, it's a multi-layered process, and I'm sure you can attest to this. It's something I can attest to, that it's definitely a practice. It's not something you could pick up right away. It takes years of really engaging in historical research to really perfect how it is to effectively go about the historical research process. So it's not something that I think could be easily explained in this sort of format. It's definitely a hands-on type of thing that you really have to engage in yourself to get a feel for how that work is done. But as I pointed out, the main thing is just being aware of the type of sources that you're relying on and looking to understand why is the source recording the information in the manner that the information is being recorded.
Very good. And I'm going to take a step back. You talked about the basis of these origin myths being rooted in maybe we call it self-abasement, lack of pride in who one is. But we tend to find individuals who engage in these origin myths that they are non-African or they're not of African descent, typically being in community or proximity with Black people. How do you explain that conundrum?
It's actually it's a very sad situation. A lot of them have no choice because the people that they're claiming that they are won't accept them. And I mean, an example that we see of this is when we talk with the Hebrew Israelites, African Americans, and not just African Americans, we have them in the Caribbean as well. These people who claim that they're a lost tribe of Israel, but then when they go to Israel, they find that the Israelis don't actually accept them as being Israelis or accept them as being Jews. So it's very often the case that these individuals who claim a particular identity outside of the African community have no other community to rely on but the same African community that they're trying to escape from. And this breeds a sense of frustration in these people where you don't see yourself as being Black, but at the same time, the people who you want to identify with don't want to accept you. And that's obviously the dilemma that integrationists for several generations have had to confront in the United States. This what Du Bois called double consciousness. This idea of trying to be an American in an American society that does not accept Black people as being American. So like I said, we find the same thing with other identities as well. The people who claim to be Hebrew Israelites that are not accepted by the Israelis. Same thing with the Nation of Islam. They claim to be Asiatic Black men, but obviously if you go to Asia, nowhere in Asia are Black people viewed as being Asiatic or accepted as such. So that's the dilemma that those groups are confronted with, that they don't want to identify with the African community, but they very often have no other community to go to but us.
Very good. And you talked about primary sources and secondary sources. So you mentioned a primary source being a firsthand account. Could you share with us what are some other examples of primary sources in historical research?
Yeah, so as I said, it's mainly a first-hand account or an account from somebody who was a witness at the time that the particular events were taking place or who were around at the time that the particular events were taking place. So ultimately a primary source is just a source that was written more or less either at the time that the event took place or written by somebody who was there at the time that the event took place. And as I pointed out, the difference between a primary and a secondary source is that typically a secondary source would be somebody who is conducting research on the basis of compiling information from primary sources. So these are, secondary sources are really what historians compile, documents that historians put together on the basis of primary research. And secondary sources can be very important as well because, as I spoke about with bias, so one advantage that a secondary source might have is having some distance from the situation. People who compile secondary sources have the advantage of hindsight. So that if you're a primary source writing about a historical situation at the time that is presently unfolding, you don't have the benefit of hindsight, where somebody trying to analyze the history after the fact does have the benefit of hindsight. Also, the benefit of distance as well. If you're closer to the situation, that might create a situation where you're too biased or too attached to view the situation objectively. So secondary sources do also have a particular benefits of sometimes being more objective. That's not necessarily always the case. There's always a bias or agenda in everything. So it's not necessarily the case that secondary sources are always more objective, but that is one particular advantage that you could find in a primary source, that it could possibly be more objective than a source that was written at the time.
Okay. So we're going to kind of move forward the conversation. We're now going to look at debunking some African diaspora origin myths. As you know, one of those myths is the belief that all Black people are descendants of the Moors. Could you do a deeper dive into why that is incorrect?
So, and this is where sources become important. We know it's incorrect because when we look at slave narratives that are actually documented by enslaved African people, none of them actually claim to be Moors. So, and this is a common thing we see in a lot of these claims, that actual enslaved people, when they documented their history, were not claiming to be the things that we claim to be now. So we just know from the historical records that African people who came to America were not claiming to be Moors, nor would they have done so, because part of the confusion around this claim to be Moors is many of us don't even know what a Moor actually is. And what a Moor is a very generic term for the Muslim population of North Africa. And it doesn't correspond to any particular ethnic group or even a racial group. So that there are, Arab Moors, Berber Moors, and African Moors.
And even white Europeans.
So when we look at the history of the Moorish conquest of Spain, a lot of Europeans who converted to the Islamic religion were actually white Moors, and there's literature talking about white Moors and distinguishing between the white Moors and the African Moors. So that's part of the issue with claiming that we're Moors, is that Moor is a very generic term. It doesn't really refer to any particular group. And on top of that, if you're talking about African people being Moors, I just said that the Moor is a generic term for the Muslim population in North Africa. Most of our ancestors that came to the Americas did not come from North Africa, and many of them were not Muslims, so they wouldn't even fall under the generic category of what it was to be a Moor.
Very good, very good. So let's take another step forward, and we're going to talk about this concept of Black people claiming to be Indians, Native Americans, indigenous people, what some would call pretendians. How do we debunk that myth?
Same thing. When you go through slave narratives, again, enslaved African people were not claiming to be indigenous Americans or Native Americans. And I think this one is a bit trickier, because what a lot of people will do is if they have any type of Native American ancestry, will then try to use that ancestry to claim that Black people are indigenous to America, or that these connections have always been there. But the reality is that African people are distinct people who came to the Americas from Africa. Now, the fact that there was some intermixture between African people and Native Americans doesn't necessarily it doesn't negate our African identity. But as I pointed out, some people are so desperate to escape African identity that they'll try to cling to whatever Native ancestry they have. And then what comes out of that are these different myths. As I pointed out, that some people make the extreme claim that the slave trade never happened and that Black people were just always in the Americas to begin with. And again, there's no slave narrative that I'm aware of written by an enslaved African person who claimed to be Native American, who claimed that they were here. And matter of fact, many of them actually were written by people who either were taken from Africa or who had parents or grandparents or great-grandparents that were taken from Africa. So that during the period of slavery, the people who were enslaved and were documenting their circumstances were not too far removed from Africa if they hadn't come from Africa themselves.
So I want to get this right? Just for some clarity for our course viewing audience, of course, the students who are watching here in the center right now. You're stating, because I've heard in the community that the transatlantic slave trade did not happen, and that this was a myth created by white people to make us believe we were African when we truly are indigenous peoples of America. And you're stating that the transatlantic slave trade did happen.
It did happen, and there's two reasons why that claim bothers me. The first reason is that the slave trade is not just something that white people claim. It's actually documented in our history. I spoke about slave narratives that were actually written by enslaved African people. But even in West Africa, when you go to West Africa, part of the oral historical tradition of West Africa is the historical memory of the slave trade and the impact that the slave trade had in West Africa. So it's something that's recorded in the histories of African people, both in the diaspora and in Africa. It's not just a claim that white people make. But my other issue with that is, what would the benefits of that be for white people? Why white people conduct this narrative, create this whole narrative that the slave trade, which never happened, was a thing that happened? And in what way does it actually advance white people or benefit white people to lie about that? And I mentioned that because up to now, I've never actually received an answer for that. That if this whole thing was a myth, how does that benefit white people, and how does it benefit us to uncover this myth?
Right. Very good. Very good. The tribe of Shabazz, right? We're familiar with the Nation of Islam. The argument was that Black people, of course, are from the lost tribe. And of course, we know tribe is a pejorative term, but we're just using it in this context, family, just in this context for the conversation and the question of lost tribe of Shabazz. Is there a tribe? Was there a group of ethnic or clan in Africa known as Shabazz?
So this one's actually interesting to me, because I don't know how many people actually are aware of the tribe of Shabazz, because I think with the Nation of Islam, most of us know very broad, general aspects of the teaching of the Nation of Islam. So that's one that I don't know how widespread it actually is outside of people who are actually familiar with the teachings of the Nation of Islam. But to answer that question, no, there was no historic tribe of Shabazz. And actually, the Nation of Islam's teachings about the tribe of Shabazz is that, as I mentioned before, the Nation of Islam says that Black people were Asiatic. Black people, we originate from Asia, specifically Arabia. So according to their teachings, Shabazz was a scientist who came out of Asia and decided to move his people to the jungles of Africa. fitting
I'm
the
familiar with
stereotype
the
of
history.
Africa at the time, that Africa was just jungles. So he took his people to the jungles of Africa, and their features started changing. According to Nation of Islam, Asiatic Black people are dark-skinned people with straight hair. So it's through living in the jungles of Africa that we developed the hair texture that we have. So according to the Nation of Islam, the tribe of Shabazz is actually where African people in the diaspora descend from. That we come from the people who came into Africa with Shabazz, and from Africa is where our ancestors were taken and enslaved. So in a sense, the Nation of Islam's narrative is a bit more historically accurate, that it does claim that our ancestors came from Africa and that they were taken as slaves from Africa. It's not a situation where they're denying any African connection or denying the slave trade. It's just they add an extra narrative to the history that suggests that we didn't really originate in Africa. We actually came into Africa from Asia, and it was a tribe leader named Shabazz that took us into these jungles in Africa.
Very good, very good. So we're going to play a game called Mythbusters with, of course, your favorite historian's favorite historian, and of course, my Pan-African big brother, barrister. I could call you barrister now, right? Dwayne Omowale. And so, Mythbusters. One of the myths that we find when people discuss, of course, the enslavement of African people that we know and call the Maafa or the Holocaust of enslavement, is that America barely received any slaves. Is this accurate?
No, so I think this misconception comes from the fact that the majority of enslaved Africans actually were taken to South America. So I think this creates the perception that North America barely received any slaves, but it would not be accurate.
Very good. Myth 2, there aren't any slave ships.
Yeah, so again, this comes from certain misconceptions. And in this case, the fact that a lot of slave ships actually weren't preserved because of the material that they were made with resulted in natural deterioration over time. And also the fact that a lot of slave ships actually had to disguise themselves because slave trading at some point was made illegal, so that there weren't any ways to actually outwardly tell that a particular ship was a slave ship. And also because slave trading was illegal, there would be no particular purpose to preserve slave ships for that reason. But we do know that they actually were slave ships because the wreckages of certain ships have been discovered. But as I pointed out, there wasn't really any process in which, or a need to preserve the slave ships. So most of the slave ships have not been preserved, but the wreckages of them exist and historical records of them do exist.
Okay. And so, we went over, we are the lost tribe of Israel, right? Well, I think not we haven't really gone over this concept of Hebrew Israelites, right? Yeah. Where did this come from and why?
So the where, I think where it comes from is enslaved African people on the plantations developed a type of spiritual connection to the Hebrews of the Bible, because the Hebrews in the Bible were also people who were enslaved and oppressed as well. So this began as a spiritual connection, and over time certain African people took it to be an actual literal connection to the Hebrews of the Bible, in which we believe that we actually are descendants of the lost tribe of Israel. Again, this is not based in reality. The reality is that most of us are descendants of Africans who came from West Africa, who were not practicing Judaism when we arrived here. So we're not members of the tribe of Israel at all. And matter of fact, the Africans on the continent that do have a connection to Israel would be in East Africa, but particularly the Ethiopians actually do have a historical connection to Israel, but it's not a connection that most of us who descend from people taken from West and Central Africa would even have. And as I pointed out some time ago on your show, that even the Ethiopians draw a clear distinction between themselves and the Jewish people, so that even though they have that connection, they don't see themselves as being a tribe of Israel.
Very true. And what would be another way that one would be able to draw a distinction or draw a line in the sand regarding this myth? Particularly when we talk about cultural retention in the Western world for African people.
But as I pointed out, one of the ways we would draw this line is religion, that African people were not practicing the religion of Judaism. But there's other examples as well. Language, African people developed their own distinct languages. And matter of fact, there are linguistic survivals throughout the diaspora, so that in certain parts of the diaspora, particularly the Caribbean and among the Gullah Geechee people, you even find African loanwords that survived. Now, yes. To my knowledge, there is no Hebrew loanwords in any African Cree languages. So that would indicate that our ancestors did not come speaking Hebrew; they came speaking African languages. Foods as well, we see clear retentions in African foods, musical traditions, and dances. So when we look at African diaspora culture, all of the cultural retentions would indicate a direct connection to Africa, and there's not much in the way of a connection to the Hebrew people.
And when you talk about language, you mentioned the Gullah Geechee and the Sea Islands of, the southeastern United States. You also could look at in Jamaica, what we call patois, or even in Haiti, what's known as Haitian Creole, right? Ça passe to my brothers and sisters from Haiti who are watching, right? So I think that's a great point. Another prevalent myth that we find is that slavery taught African people skills. This is accurate.
No, not at all. It actually, it reverses the reality of the historical situation. One of the reasons why Europeans even enslaved Africans in the first place was to take advantage of the skills that we already had.
Very true. Yes. Right. Another myth is that slavery was deliverance from life in Africa.
And again, this is where primary sources become important, because actual Africans who were enslaved did not say so. They had much different views of slavery, particularly those who were actually taken from Africa. And I think those narratives are especially important because it really indicates that the people who actually were directly stolen from Africa much preferred their life in Africa over life being enslaved in the Americas.
Very good, very good. And we know another way we're able to differentiate between fact and myth is the fact that the average life expectancy of an enslaved African on a sugar plantation was only 7 years. So we find that they literally were being worked to death. Now, this is another prevalent myth that oftentimes one will receive if they are involved in a religious community, and that is that slavery taught African people about God.
No, African people had their own conceptions of God before slavery, and some examples of this is for example the Akan people, in their language God is Nyame, Ulurun is the Yoruba word for God. So across Africa we find that African people had not only conceptions of God, but also conceptions of religion. Part of the justification for slavery and colonialism was this idea that African people lacked understanding of God and African people lacked proper religion. So it's important to understand the actual history of African people, and this also really it relates to some of the myths you spoke about as well, with the tribe of Israel and even the tribe of Shabazz, that there's certain religious groups, such as the Hebrew Israelites or the Nation of Islam, who cling to certain religious mythologies out of this idea that African people didn't have conceptions of God or conceptions of religion prior to Abrahamic religions.
Very good. Great point. So we're going to move forward a little bit here now. And we're going to kind of discuss a scenario. I think we all have been at a barbershop before, engaged in conversation. And so in this scenario, you're sitting at the salon, barbershop, and you hear this conversation. Someone claims that they would never seen a slave ship. Another person responds the slave trade never happened. We kind of went over this. A third claims that it did not, but the slaves didn't come from Africa. They were already in America. A fourth last says that they're all wrong, and this is basic history. When they ask for sources, he stumbles. It's just obvious. What evidence could you provide to get to the bottom of this?
So there's a lot happening there. I have to take it one by one. So obviously, starting with the person who says they've never seen a slave ship, that's why I made the point that there wasn't a deliberate effort to actually preserve slave ships, and very often slave ships actually had to disguise themselves as something that didn't look like a slave ship. So we do have the problem in terms of slave ships of there not being the effort to preserve them, and also the fact that many of the slave ships weren't outwardly known to be slave ships. But as I pointed out, we do have evidence of wreckages of slave ships. So we do have the physical documentation that slave ships existed, but we also have written documentation as well, and even slave ships themselves actually kept logs of their cargo, which was our ancestors. Our ancestors were the cargo on slave ships. So we do have not only existing surviving slave ships, we do have written records as well of the fact that slave ships existed and made several travels through Africa, from Africa to the Americas. Now, the slave trade never happening. same thing. We have written accounts of the fact that the slave trade existed, and these accounts come from not only the Europeans who were involved as slave traders. We also have accounts from African people, as I pointed out, both those who were enslaved in the Americas and also on the continent, the Africans who weren't captured during the slave trade, but who would have a historical recollection of having ancestors who were captured or having people who were captured. So that there's a large amount of documentation of the slave trade across the different continents.
Phyllis Wheatley would be a great example.
Yes.
Right. A lot of Equiano would be another example of African people who were actually captured, transported during the Middle Passage to the Americas. That can debunk the myth.
Who wrote about those experiences? Or Robert Campbell. He was a Jamaican. He was born in Jamaica, but he recorded during his travels in West Africa, which is currently Nigeria. He recorded that the people there actually asked him what part of Africa his ancestors came from. And the reason why they were asking is because they had ancestors that were actually captured in the slave trade. So they were trying to ascertain if he could have been their family. So as I pointed out, even on the continent, Africans were aware of the fact that their people were being captured and enslaved. So this is something that exists both in the historical records of the African diaspora, but also in the historical records of people on the African continent.
Yes, even in Dahomey, for example, who was at one point the leading, slave trading nation, unfortunately, on the continent, and their laws were stated that you could not enslave someone who was Dahomean, right? So we see this, of course, nationalistic impetus in the laws of the land.
And actually, Dahomey is a great example because Dahomey's entire social system was really restructured because of the slave trade. It was restructured both to defend Dahomey against slave trading from other kingdoms, but also to uphold Dahomey's own involvement in the slave trade in terms of raiding different nations, capturing those people and shipping them into slavery. So we even see that the slave trade actually transformed the culture and the political systems in West Africa.
Absolutely. And another myth that is rather prevalent, and I should have mentioned this before, is the myth that the slave trade happened, but it happened in reverse. What do you say to that?
Again, I go back to primary sources. Where are the primary sources indicating that it happened in reverse, but also, and this is why I made the point before about the logic of these arguments. Where's the logic in why people inventing the slave trade as something that never happened? And it's the same thing here. What would the logic be of even doing the slave trade in reverse to begin with? Because we know all the plantations were here in the Americas at the time of the slave trade. Europeans hadn't colonized Africa and established plantations there. So why would they be shipping Native Americans to Africa to do what?
Right. Very good. And so when we talk about evidence, family, there is evidence to substantiate this. And a great piece of evidence would be, of course, Zoe Neale Hurston, a powerful sister who, of course, was an anthropologist from the great state of Florida. Her book, Barracoon, right? The story of the last black cargo. And, of course, the last slave ship, help me with the pronunciation. Cotilda.
Cotilda, yes.
Right. Yes. So this would be evidence to, of course, disabuse one of their belief in some of these myths regarding Black people, Black origin myths. So it's something, of course, to be cognizant of. We have a question, a comment here from Mr. Sandman, where he states that some people, let me pull this up here, give me 1 second. He states that some people would argue that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, he's speaking of the Gospels of the Bible, were primary sources. No pushback, just saying. What would you say to that?
Actually, by definition, they will not be primary sources. And I mean, we know how the life and work of Jesus was documented, is that these Gospels were actually written after the fact. They're not contemporary documentation of what was taking place. And I mean, when you read the Gospels, they're written that way. They're not written as first-person narratives of these events that are unfolding by people who were there. They're actually written as narratives about things that happened after the fact.
Yes, if I remember correctly, when I took a class regarding this subject matter, I think the Gospels were written maybe about almost a century after.
Yeah, quite a while after, because
yes.
And this gets into the history of Christianity. But really, what it was is that initially the followers of Jesus actually were expecting the second coming was to happen soon.
Yes.
And when they realized that it wasn't happening as quickly as they realized, that's when they started, realizing they need to document the teachings and the life of Jesus. So I think it wouldn't be a non-controversial argument to point out that the gospel is actually not primary sources, and when you read them, it's pretty clear that they're not primary sources. And matter of fact, the authors of the gospel never actually met Jesus.
Yes.
So
well, you're going to upset some people there, but
well, I mean, but the thing is, I don't necessarily know if it would be uncontroversial. I mean, even in Christian circles, these are things that are just widely understood in terms of even Christian.
Well, I would say an educated Christian.
But yeah, because I mean, I came out of Catholic school, so this is how they were teaching us in Catholic school, that these were not primary sources. These were written by men who never met Jesus, and they were written quite a while after the events which took place. So those would actually be good examples of what we'd call a secondary source.
Yes. So if you have any questions, you could put them in the chat, and we'd be more than willing to actually engage. Barrister, a historian, your favorite Pan-Africanist, Dwayne Omowale, of course, with questions regarding this conversation where we're debunking, of course, African Diaspora Origin Myths. I think this is a great conversation that needs to be had. Of course, some of my students even asked these questions, and I said, I can answer the questions, but I know someone who can do even a better job of me. So, I'm always hyping you up. I always state that if there was a Jesus to Christ, I would be John the Baptist, right? So as you rise, of course, I do not. But it's a great conversation that we wanted to have. But once again, if you would like to ask a question, you can put your question in the chat. You're, of course, watching the MLK Center on YouTube, of course, where we affirm the dream of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. by representing the zenith of Dr. King's political maturation by always betting on Black. All right. So if there are no further questions, I want to thank everyone for taking time to take part in our first Lunch and Learn series of the semester. Make sure you like, subscribe, and share. And please make a gift to the MLK Center. You can find the donation link in the description. Until next time, you know what to do. Affirm the dream of Dr. King. Peace.